Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part 12 of an ongoing series talking about software updates in ConfigMgr, now Current Branch. And the focus today, System Center Updates Publisher. I'll keep referring to it as SCUP because that's a whole lot easier to say. So here's the agenda where we're headed. Basically, this introduction talking about what is SCUP and why we care as ConfigMgr admins. Really then focusing on SCUP, I want to look back and see the history of SCUP and talk about what's new, go through some of the requirements, talk about the components that are going to be involved in SCUP, and then the most of our time will be spent in the install and configure section, walking through SCUP, seeing it in action. We'll wrap up by talking about SCUP and third-party update management just a bit, because the next session will be focused on third-party update management that is coming in ConfigMgr 1806. First started to show up a little bit in 1802, but 1806 is where it really comes to light. And then we'll talk about a few troubleshooting tips and tricks, and we'll be done. So let's jump in. So what is SCUP, System Center Updates Publisher? Well, if you look online and look at the definitions that are available on the documentation you'll find for SCUP, you'll see System Center Updates Publisher is an application that enables independent software vendors or line of business application developers and IT administrators to import software update catalogs, create and modify software update definitions, export update definitions to catalogs, and publish software update information to a configured update server. And that's all true. And you can read it again online if you'd like. SCUP really is an application that enables management of third-party updates in two big broad categories. First would be updates that are prepared by vendors, software update partners, if you will, and would include folks like HP, Dell, Adobe, there's Fujitsu in there, and more, right? So these would be catalogs that the vendor themselves maintains. The vendor themselves will publish into SCUP, and then you can take advantage of the work that they've done and just simply select which updates you care about to publish into your environment and to deploy into your environment, right? Then there's a big second category, and that would be custom updates. So these could be custom updates that you prepare as IT, knowing that there's some software out there that really isn't managed, isn't maintained, right? Or it could be for a custom application that's within your organization. So the developers of that application could prepare updates for that application using the tools that you're going to see in this session, right? So said another way, and shifting over, why SCUP? Organizations around the world have for years leveraged ConfigMgr to address the needs of maintaining Microsoft software, keeping it up to date. That's Windows, that's Office, and other things, lots of other things, right? But largely, third-party updates or third-party applications, non-Microsoft applications, if you will, have been either left unattended or it's kind of been a mixed result as to how they get updated, if they do at all, etc., right? So why SCUP would be, we through this tool enable you to take advantage of the same exact processes that you use every single month to maintain Microsoft systems in your environment and extend that to these third parties. So said another way, SCUP allows you to extend the scope of existing software update operations, existing underlined, right? There's lots of organizations that have done a lot to prepare business groups for, get agreement with business groups for the monthly software updating that needs to happen. Right? Why not leverage that exact same model to deploy these updates to third parties versus building another process around it? This provides you additional business value. It leverages your existing investment in ConfigMgr. Doesn't really ramp up the difficulty of building new processes at all. It kind of fits nicely into that infrastructure by letting you leverage those familiar processes for updating monthly. So SCUP, a look back quickly and kind of talking about what's new. The version of SCUP that we're going to be talking about today is the third version. There have been two previous ones. So we first introduced SCUP version 4.5. So this was released December 15th of 2008. And now pulling back a little bit of the nerd value, I guess, the deep dive value, one thing that kind of stood apart with this release of SCUP 4.5 was that it maintained a traditional SQL database for storing all the details that SCUP needs to deal with, the third-party updates, custom updates, publishing, et cetera, all of that was in a traditional SQL database. The fact it was a traditional SQL database meant that any user who opened SCUP would have a shared environment. So if you had 5 or 6 different people developing updates for SCUP, they would all have a shared environment, right? SCUP 2011 was introduced in May 16th of 2016 and brought with it an updated UI. Also brought with it support for additional operating systems, Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8.1, the equivalent of the server OSs for that, right? And SCUP 2011 fully supported on ConfigMgr 2007, ConfigMgr 2012, and 2012 R2. What it also brought with it was an individualized experience. So what that means is if you had those 5 or 6 developers that were building software updates and they all had SCUP 2011 and they opened it for the first time, they would get their own unique instance of a database created. So they have their own development environment, right? Now you may want that, you may not want that. If you don't want that, there are ways to go back to the old way. But while SCUP 2011 still uses a SQL database, it is not a traditional SQL database. It's SQL Compact. Right? And then comes SCUP 2018. Now, I call it 2018 because we're just kind of talking about releases here. Whenever you see me launch this in just a minute, you will know or notice that it doesn't actually advertise itself as SCUP 2018, but I call it that because it was released in March 21st of this year, 2018, and specifically added support for Windows 10 Server 2016. Also is supported with ConfigMgr 2012, ConfigMgr Current Branch, and ConfigMgr LTSV. Right. Another thing that's kind of behind the scenes that you'll see, we'll talk about a little bit as we go through this session. Whenever we talk about updates that are available in SCUP, whether they're from third-party vendors or whether you create them yourself, ultimately those updates live in what's called an update catalog. So this release of SCUP added support for an updated catalog format, right? So in this case, I've not seen official names for those differences. I call it call the differences either legacy versus current, or sometimes I may refer to it as a V1 versus V2 catalog. Either way, we'll talk about those differences just a bit as we go through here in a minute. All right. So in terms of requirements for SCUP, just a few things. You do need an available update catalog that you can then use to publish different updates to WSUS. This can again be vendor provided, can be custom created. It can use the updated or the legacy catalog format. Again, more discussion of that near the end. I'll just kind of touch on it a bit. We're not going to get too deep into it. WSUS 4.1 or better. And then WSUS and SSL is an interesting one. So strictly speaking, there is not a specific requirement for, well, let me say it a different way. So the WSUS and SSL requirement exists only when your SCUP console is remote from your WSUS server. Now, this is something that is a WSUS API requirement. It is not a SCUP requirement. SCUP has to leverage what's out there. So, say it again. If you have SCUP remote from your WSUS server, then WSUS requires that it is running in SSL mode in order to accept publications from SCUP. This is just a way that WSUS can ensure secure connections and so on. Now, if SCUP is local to the WSUS server, then that's not required at all. By the fact it's local, it's kind of able to be a trusted connection that way. If you do need to shift your WSUS server into SSL mode, that does not mean that your ConfigMgr clients who will ultimately consume the updates will be required to access your WSUS SCUP in SSL mode. It is purely for publishing. And one of the things, that really needs to be published to enable all of this is called a signing certificate. So sometimes whenever the word certificate is mentioned, it strikes fear into the heart of ConfigMgr admins. There are definitely complex certificate scenarios. The one that I will show you is probably the most simple certificate scenario there could be, right? So we'll talk about that. The signing certificate can either be a self-signed cert, that's what I'll use, or it could be produced by a certificate authority, such as a commercial certificate authority, an on-prem certificate authority. Again, this is required by WSUS in order to be able to sign the content, right? Well, fast forward a little bit here. Whenever we're talking about updates, third-party updates, or any update for that matter, there's really two ways to view that update. Either as what's called metadata only, which is enough information about the update to allow you to scan in the environment and determine if you even need it at all. And there's also metadata plus content. That's called full publication in the SCUP world, as you'll see in a minute. And in that scenario, there will actually be content downloaded from the vendor or provided by yourself whenever you're building custom catalogs. That content has to be digitally signed in order to be consumed by clients in the enterprise. I'll probably say this again just to make sure it's said a couple of times. All of the Microsoft updates are the same requirements exist for the Microsoft updates that you're accustomed to putting out to your environment. The difference is they are already digitally signed and already trusted by all of the clients because they are signed by Microsoft, right? So that's what the WSUS signing certificate does, is it allows signing the content specifically with a certificate that you know, right? That's why this signing certificate not only needs to be on the WSUS server, but also on every single client and trusted by every single client. Again, the process, not difficult, right? Now, with the introduction of third-party update integration in ConfigMgr 1802, the very, very beginnings of this, there are options to be able to manage these certificates by ConfigMgr, right? There's options in site settings, there's options in client settings. They really show up more whenever we get to 1806, right? But anyway, they're out there. And then I say OS version. So this one's interesting because if you do have a remote installation of SCUP, right? In order for SCUP to be able to publish its content into WSUS, the WSUS APIs require that that instance of SCUP be running on the same version of OS as is WSUS. To give you a specific, if you're running SCUP on a Windows 10 system and your WSUS or your SUP is running on a Server 2012 R2 system, then you cannot use SCUP from a Windows 10 workstation to publish to WSUS SUP on a Server 2012 R2. They have to match in terms of OS version. All right? Okay. So some of the components that we're talking about with SCUP, right? So, and processes too. So components and processes for SCUP specifically. When we think about using SCUP, there are three big broad categories of things that we will use SCUP to do. The first is to obtain and import vendor-supplied updates. Right? There are, again, certain catalogs, you'll see them in a minute, that you can download and begin to use right away. Or if you want to create your own custom updates, we will use SCUP for authoring those custom updates. And then once we have all the updates vetted and ready to go, then SCUP will be the tool to manage and publish the updates. Now, I'm going to again put a big asterisk around this because, again, we're focusing on SCUP right now, but third-party update integration in Configuration Manager, there's some good complement to the two together, right? So just stay tuned as we get to the third-party updates, and we'll focus on that specifically, and hopefully you'll see how SCUP and third-party updates can fit together and so on. Either way you slice it, depending on the scenario, SCUP will have a role, even if you're using third-party update integration in ConfigMgr. But again, we'll save all of that discussion for the next session. And then in terms of components specifically that you will need in terms of working with SCUP, first would be certificates. We've talked about this. I already mentioned it a couple of times. I'll mention it a few times just to set it in your brain. The certificate can either be signed by a certificate authority, either commercial or your own on-prem, or it can be self-signed. Self-signed is the easiest. That's what I'm going to use. The third-party update signing certificate, again, is used to make sure that the updates are trusted by the infrastructure, right? Again, for full content only, and the client needs to have that as well. So the cert needs to be throughout the infrastructure. You also need an update catalog. Again, vendor supplied or custom created, and it may be, depending on where you get it, either in the legacy catalog format or the updated catalog format. More on that as we get further along, right? And then individual updates. So individual updates will be supplied to you in the catalog or custom created, and whenever you deal with them, you will deal with them as either metadata only or metadata plus content. So again, just make sure I say it. Metadata only and metadata with content is exactly the scenario that you deal with ConfigMgr updates for Microsoft products today. The metadata only is whenever we synchronize Microsoft updates and they show up in your console, and then we go scan to tell you whether those updates are necessary or not. The way that we're able to scan is because we have the update metadata available that the client can use and Windows Update Agent can use to do the scan. All I'm talking about here is making sure you have that same metadata for the third-party updates and published into WSUS so we can take advantage of it. Same deal. Then metadata plus content is exactly the same as ConfigMgr. Whenever you identify an update that you want to deploy in your environment, you need to obtain the content using standard practices like you do in ConfigMgr today. In SCUP, whenever we're going to publish an update and we know we need it in the environment and want to actually deploy it to make it actionable and installable, you need to publish it with content. It's called full update publishing, right? You'll see that in a minute. There's also some group policy settings, one in particular that you need to have turned on clients in addition to having the certificate there. Okay, so with that said, it's time to kind of walk through installing and configuring. So let me pull in my ConfigMgr site server, and actually what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pull in my technical preview system here. And the reason is because this one is actually configured WSUS for SSL. So don't pay any attention to the ConfigMgr console or the registry yet. All right. So first thing I want to show you before we kind of get started is the whole idea of configuring WSUS to support SSL. So we talked through the scenario where WSUS needs to be configured for SSL, and that's a requirement of the WSUS API if publishing third-party updates from a remote version of SCUP. Again, no requirement for the clients to be configured for SSL when accessing the software update point. So the first thing you need to do, which I'm not going to show you here, I've already got it done, is configure a server auth certificate. There's lots of ways that you can do it. We actually give you in the certificate examples that we publish on TechNet how you would go about doing that, but this server auth cert will be used to allow SSL to work on IIS specifically. So we've already got that. So I'm just going to go straight into IIS, and we'll walk through configuring WSUS into SSL mode. So under Windows Administrative Tools, we'll go to IIS. All right, so I'm going to expand this and expand sites. Here's my WSUS administration site. So I'm going to right-click on it and edit bindings. So here's port 8531. This is for SSL. If I go and edit this, you will see that I do have an SSL cert selected. This is the one that I created for server authentication. It's just a jumble of characters here. So how do I know it's the right one? Because there are a number of them here, right? Well, because I can view the cert and specifically see that it was issued by my certificate authority, which is what I would expect. And then also by the template that I would expect, ConfigMgr Lab server auth, right? And I also see that it is used for server auth. So I'm good to go here. So I've selected it, good to go, and close. Now that I've selected that, there are certain subcomponents, subsites, if you will, that I do need to shift over and tell those sites to use SSL. Specifically, I'll start with API remoting 3.0. And if I go to SSL settings, very simply require SSL, right? Then I need to do the same thing for client web service, and then DSS auth web service, then server sync web service, and simple auth web service, right? Once I get that done, so this is again my technical preview site, so ignore the difference in it. But once I get that done, under sites, under under servers and site system roles, my software update point, simply I will shift into requiring SSL communication, right? Again, doesn't mean that the clients have to talk to WSUS SCUP with SSL, but the site server will, right? And then, so how do I tell if in fact the configuration to shift WSUS into SSL mode has taken place? Well, one way is to look in the WCM.log. That one, I don't know if we repeat the entry. I know that we log it, initially after. You'll see some indications in the log and being in SSL mode and so on. Initially after the configuration change, but I didn't follow it to see if we repeat that. The best place, I think, is in the registry, right? Best two places. One is in the registries. So here, specifically, I'm already on the update services server setup key right down here. And there's two places. First, using SSL is now configured to 1, which means yes, right? And then also, the port number is 8531, which is SSL, so I know I'm good to go. And then the ultimate test on whether you're able to be using SSL is that you're able to synchronize and interact with that WSUS server just like you would expect that you would want to, right? Okay, so let's get rid of the technical preview site. And so now that we've got that out of the way, again, you only need that if SCUP is remote from WSUS, and that's a requirement of the WSUS API, right? But now that we're past that, let's go through and actually look at installing SCUP. So here's my my site server, and we'll ignore the updates that are available. They'll come up, and we'll get rid of them. There we go. Great. So I don't have SCUP here running yet at all. It is installed, and there's no ConfigMgr console we're looking at yet. Simply, we're going to look at the idea of installing SCUP. So installing SCUP is really easy. It's just an MSI. You can launch it and run through it, and you'll see really quickly that mine's already installed, so I'm not going to do it again, right? But pretty simple MSI. Just click through it and let it install, and you're good to go. Now, the first time that you want to launch this, right, I told you that we create an individualized instance of the SCUP database for every SCUP user. So I'm logged on as the administrator account, but to demonstrate this, I'm going to launch SCUP using a different user. So I'm going to say, who am I? You'll see that I'm test user. And so I'm going to launch SCUP. And so it's going to kick in, yes, good to go, and start to launch and check, and then we'll come back up into a blank console because this is the first time this test user has ever launched SCUP, right? Just like if you installed SCUP for a new developer somewhere and they launched it for the first time, this is the console they would see and the experience they would have whenever it's first coming up to date. Okay, so checking for updates, and then that takes a minute, and then we'll go through and check for an existing database. Okay, good. So yeah, we recognize it's the first time. Good to go. checking database, so we don't have one. We're going to create one, and you'll see where we create it in a minute. And so we're done with that, and now SCUP comes up. And this is the console, right? And it really doesn't have anything in it at all, right? So what I would need to do, and in fact, I'm just going to use this console. Let me show you the difference, right? So this is the one for test user. If I go ahead and close this and just launch the command prompt again. So I am logged on as administrator. So if I go launch the SCUP console, under that context, when it installs, it will put itself here. In my case, well, it's already running. Okay, so in my case, SCUP is fully populated already. I'm going to use this existing instance of the console just for now to kind of walk through some configurations, and we'll shift to the other one here in just a minute. But while we're in this empty console, let's kind of walk through it. So the console is empty under all software updates, right? Because we don't have any software updates that we've selected yet. One question kind of on a tangent that comes up sometimes is, once we get through this process, once SCUP publishes updates to WSUS, can you then see them and deploy them directly from WSUS? And the answer is no, because when they are there, but if you then go into SCUP after you publish the updates and try to find them by the update ID or whatever, they're hidden. They're not going to show up in the WSUS console. They will be in ConfigMgr, but not the WSUS console. Anyway, so we need to go configure SCUP. So we can either do that by selecting options here, or just use our Getting Started section. And so let's just use Getting Started to go configure WSUS in our signing cert. So the first thing, enable publishing to an update server, right? I have to turn that on. And then I can either say local or remote, and I can go test my connection. Now notice this is using 8530, because in this case it's local, so I'm not using SSL. And I'm going to check, and good enough, I have found my connection. Notice what else I've found. That I've already got the WSUS self-signed cert. Why? And notice it was created on July 2nd, and it's not July 2nd. Why do I have that cert already? Because my other instance of the SCUP console created that cert in WSUS, and so we're not going to just create multiple ones again and again. We'll use the one that we found, right? So if you want to use a different one for whatever reason, you can. You just have to browse to it here and so on. The WSUS self-signed is definitely the easiest. Walking on through here, configuring connection to the ConfigMgr site server. I won't actually do that because I've got it done in the other console, which we'll work with for the rest of this once we get done with this. Suffice it to say right now that the integration with the ConfigMgr site server is really solely for the purpose of allowing SCUP, when you publish an update, to leverage ConfigMgr data to decide whether you publish metadata only or full content. And to be completely honest, I'm not a huge fan of this, right? It's there, but for what it does, I would rather be in charge of deciding whether I'm publishing metadata or full content. You'll see that in a minute when we get to the publishing section. I shift into the other console, right? So I'm not even going to configure this. This gives you an option to configure proxy settings. This will show you all the trusted publishers. So I have no updates in here right now. When I go up, grab and subscribe to a catalog, then those catalogs will have certificates that come along with them. And so those will then be considered trusted publishers, right? Then there's some advanced stuff. So I talked about how every user has an individualized database. Here is under users, temp is the username that I'm using here, but this is the location of the SCUP SQL Compact database, right? So if you don't want the individualized experience of SCUP, you can move that database and adjust these profiles to that shared location if you want to, right? It's an option. And then other things, such as just general settings and publishing and running the software update cleanup wizard, and how you want to deal with checking for updates, showing what the logging is. Now, it doesn't show you the log name. You'll see that more in a minute when we do a publish of it, but the log is tucked under the user profile as well, right? So with that, I'm just going to shift out of this version of the console. Yeah, I really want to exit and log into the version that has got a few things in it already. Okay, so here this comes up. Okay, so let's just wait for this to come up, and then the next thing we need to do, once we have the integration done with WSUS, we need to subscribe to partner catalogs if we want any of those partner catalogs. Certainly you want to at least see what's available, and then you can decide from there whether you want to leverage any of those. I will tell you while this is loading, before we get to the partner catalogs, yeah, you want to sync at least some partner catalogs, because if you're going to be building your own updates, there is no better way to learn how to do it than by using partner catalogs where they've already done it, right? Okay, so let's expand this and go look at our partner catalog. So under our getting started section, I can go import software update catalogs. You'll see the various catalogs that I have imported already. That's not actually subscribing to the catalogs. That's looking at what I've already got already. So I clicked the wrong thing. Add partner software update catalog. So this will show all of the partners that currently publish their catalogs into SCUP, right? And so my tendency is to, hey, look at all these catalogs, let's go subscribe to them. And by the way, this list is not that long because I've already imported some catalogs. I can't, over on the side, right? I've got the Adobe catalog, I've got the HP catalog. So these are the ones that I have not imported. So I can just click on it and add and select it. The watch out here is these catalogs can be big, especially ones from Dell and HP and such. I know the one from HP has over 4,000 updates in it. Whenever you select the catalog here, it will immediately start to sync, and that can take a long time before it finishes up, right? So up to you, right, if what you want to do, but just know there's a time tax if you do all of them at the same time, right? Okay. And then once I've got that, import partner catalog is what I want, and I can choose, this will be populated based on the ones that I added in the previous step. So if I want to select one and import it, I've already got these done. Let's see, let me do the Acrobat just in case, click next. So I'll go through and I'm importing the catalog, right? So this is actually going and downloading the catalog from the vendor's site and going through the process of importing it. Again, this can take a little bit of time. In this case, it didn't, but notice the thing I'm asked for. Approve the certificate for these catalogs. So just a mental asterisk here. The updated or the legacy catalog versions that we're going to talk about as we get to the end of the session, this is really what it's all about. Largely, right, is the experience with the certificate. I can either approve the certificate here or decline it or set to always approve, and we'll talk about it more in just a minute. I'm just going to approve these and go forward. We're going to go through and we're importing the catalog, and again, hopefully this won't take that long. Looks like it's almost done. There we go. So we're done, right? And so 23 updates imported, 20 updates were skipped because I've already got them imported, right? So we're good to go, and we're done. So we've imported now the catalog that we selected that we wanted to subscribe to. All right. Okay. Now, the next step would be to, before we can really do anything, configure our certificates on both the server and the client. Right. So you saw in the console here that I went through and I selected to integrate with WSUS, and you saw the signing cert that was already there, but there's a little bit of work that we need to do. In a pure SCUP environment, again, asterisk here, with the integration of third-party updates, ConfigMgr can do all of this for you if you have the WSUS self-signed. If you're using a certificate authority generated or an on-prem, either on-prem or commercial, then what I'm about to do or show you here, you would have to do yourself, right? So again, self-signed certs are easier. So you need to make sure the certs are in the correct location on both the server and on the clients, right? So let's go ahead and minimize this. So I'm going to open MMC, and here I have already the certificates listed out here. And so notice I have a WSUS cert store. You may go into the certificate snap-in and you may not see this because you may not have a cert here yet. Don't worry about it. If you don't see it, whenever you use SCUP to add the self-signed or whatever, we will create it for you, no problem. Whether WSUS is local or remote doesn't matter. And whenever we publish through SCUP the cert, it will land here, right? Here's our WSUS published self-signed cert. You see the expiration date is July 2nd because this was published on July 2nd, as you saw in the console a little bit ago, right? But having it here is only one location where it needs to be. So again, if you're using third-party update integration, which we'll talk about in the next session, all of what I'm about to show you with repositioning the cert and so on will be done for you if you're using the self-signed cert. If not, you'll have to do this manually, just like I'm about to, right? So I need to export this cert. So I'm going to export it and then take all the defaults except for the name and give it a name. And I've actually already got the cert there, as you'll see. Here the cert is. So I'm not going to export it again. But I just take the defaults and I'm good to go. Now that I have that, there are two other places I need to import it. First is under Trusted Publishers, where I do already have it. But it's easy enough to just all tasks import, browse to that location, and import the file. I also need it under Trusted Root Certificate Authorities, and it is here, right? So 3 locations on the WSUS server. Further, on the client, right? So on my client, I need that cert as well. So I'm just going to log into my test client. And in my case, I've actually done this manually because I just have one client and it's not a big deal. In a production environment, doing this manually is not desirable, right? And so you can use ConfigMgr to deploy the cert. It's actually really easy. All you need is the exported cert file, which you saw that I got on the WSUS server, and you need to have a mechanism to install it. Every modern OS has a utility called certutil. Right? So right here, right? And so it'll give you the command line options. It's really easy to pair that utility with your certificate and install it to your client. No big deal. You don't even have to deploy an executable. The executable's already there. All you need to do is deploy the cert. Anyway, so I have my certificates snap in here, and I also have GPOs in here, but let's go on down. Here's my, let me go up, certs. Okay, so I have the Trusted Publishers store where I need the WSUS self-signed on the client. And I also have my Trusted Root Certificate Authority where I need my WSUS self-signed on the client. So just 2 stores there, right? There is no WSUS store here because this is not a WSUS server. Now, in addition to the certificate settings on the client, I also need to configure a GPO setting specifically under Windows Update, right? So ConfigMgr will configure this one for you. Specify intranet Microsoft Update Service location. This one you don't have to have configured. I do in my lab because of some stuff I have going on. But the one that you need to specifically support third-party update SCUP is this one. Allow signed updates. Again, signed updates. We're signing it with the WSUS signing cert, right? Allow signed updates from an intranet Microsoft Update Service location, right? And so that's enabled, and it tells you what it does and so on. If you did not have these certs positioned correctly, if you did not have this GPO setting configured correctly, then you would run into problems trying to deploy third-party updates to your clients, right? And again, just to say it a third time, if you're using third-party update integration with Configuration Manager, starting in 1802, but even better in 1806, then ConfigMgr will do all of this for you, positioning the WSUS certs on the WSUS server, positioning the WSUS certs on the clients, and also setting that GPO option, assuming you're using self-signed certs. Right? Anyway, all right, good to go. So that's installing and configuring SCUP. Now let's kind of go through a walkthrough of SCUP itself, and then we'll kind of see things happening in action. So let me pull in the lab, and as we do this walkthrough, we're going to do it two ways. First, I want to walk through the SCUP console a bit more focused than we've done, and then we'll shift and kind of see how all this plays in Configuration Manager itself, right? So, kind of as we get started, let's pull up the SCUP console, and this one is the one that I've already got some updates in, and we'll select the All Software Updates node. Now, as we can pretty immediately maybe see, no, not yet. Well, here, right? If we expand HP Business Class, you see drivers, firmware, and software for sure. One thing I'll just call out quickly, when we think of software updates historically, it's fair to think of that process as updating existing software on systems, right? But as we can clearly see from the fact that HP and Dell and Fujitsu have their catalogs as part of SCUP, it's not just about updating software. It's updating firmware and BIOS settings and things of that nature as well, right? So kind of a cool option out there. Keeping BIOS settings and firmware all up to date in environments can be a challenge. This makes it easier, right? Also, just as a reminder, all of these updates will get published, the ones that you choose anyway, to WSUS. But if you go to WSUS and you try to find them there, you're not going to find them, right? Because they're published in such a way that ConfigMgr can grab them, but WSUS itself is not able to push them back out. Anyway, so let's just take a look at what we have here. So we have a few different columns out here, the name of the update for sure, the type of update, what class it is, all this should be familiar. Article ID as the vendor represents it. Bulletin ID as the vendor represents it. If there is a CVE ID, it's here. Whether or not that update is expired. Now, a word about these update catalogs. So if the vendor supplies the update catalog, then you need to work with that vendor should you have questions about the update catalog. In other words, don't just come in here and expire an update that you decide needs to be expired, right? Or edit an update that you decide needs to be edited. The vendor is responsible for it, just like Microsoft is responsible for our updates that we send out. If there's a mistake, we need to fix it. If there's a mistake in a vendor-supplied catalog, they need to fix it. If you go in here and start editing a vendor-supplied catalog, the results could be challenging for your environment. One example would be if you were to go through here and publish an update and then decide you don't want that update and delete it from the catalog, you would actually get a pop-up saying, hey, be careful, there's some published updates that aren't expired, etc., right? Because there is a life cycle approach to this. Updates get published, they get expired, they get superseded, they do get deleted from the catalog, etc., right? So be aware of that life cycle kind of thing. The other thing, notice this date published column. The date published is not anything to do with the catalog itself. It's when the software update was specifically published to WSUS in your environment, right? Anyway, okay. So also, let's just kind of walk through a specific update. So one of the things that I mentioned is that even if you don't want to use these updates as something to deploy in your environment, these are phenomenal learning tools about how to create your own update. I kind of parallel it to the feature introduced in ConfigMgr 2007, Desired Configuration Management Now Compliant Settings. Desired Configuration Management Now Compliant Settings is a very powerful engine to be able to look at all sorts of things in your environment. The problem was, it's kind of a blank slate. You have to build your own configurations that you want to check out in the environment. At least that was the case at first, right? But we did provide some examples that you could import into the environment and learn how to go configure compliance settings and or configuration items and baselines and so on. In a similar way, this is kind of a blank slate. If you have a need to build your own custom updates, you need to do that using this tool and so on. But how do you learn how to do it? By looking at examples like you have here in the catalog. So it's awesome, even if you don't need a particular update for a particular vendor. All right, so if we right-click on an update, we have an option Edit, and we'll get to some of the rest of these in a minute, but we'll go to Edit for now. And actually, even before we get there, we have a tremendous amount of detail about this update just by this view. The CVE number, all this stuff, the URLs for download and so on. We also see tabs for installable rules and installed rules. So just like in ConfigMgr and WSUS standalone, every update has to have a set of detection logic, if you will, to decide whether that update is needed or whether it might already be there, right? That's what installable rules and installed rules really boil down to, right? Okay, so a lot we can get just there, but if we want to see the detail of the update, we can go to Edit and start to look at the name, the download URL, any specific return codes that are interesting, any pending reboot, different things, and binary languages, and on we go, right? What specific command line will be used? There was one, I don't know if I could find the update right now, but one question came up when I was chatting about this, whether updates, executables that are applied here that do require a reboot will actually respect BitLocker. And the update we were looking at the time had a -B command line. That one indicated, it would respect BitLocker. So it's really valuable to go see the different ways in which things can be applied here, right? I'm going to go look at the HP catalog in just a minute and see if I can find that update. Now, anyway, so who the vendor is, the product, the URL for more info, what classification the update is, CVE information, bulletin ID, impact, whether the restart is necessary, and so on, right? Any prerequisites. So you have a whole slew of things that you can use for prerequisites and search for them and so on if you want to. There's supersedence. So if this update supersedes another, certainly we're familiar with supersedence with the Microsoft updates, then we can supply it here. Here's where we visualize. So this applicability is kind of the same thing as down here. We'll look at that in a minute. In fact, let me just call your eyes to this applicability. I'm going to cancel out of that. We'll come back into it in a minute and look at installable. So it's a little bit of a different name. It is, but it's the same kind of thing, right? So let's go back to Edit. And then we have installed. So basically a rule for whether this thing was installed and so on, right? And then finally a summary. I can click next to finish this thing and publish it on out. Let me go see if I can find an example of the HP update. I think just one of the ones up top will do it. Let's see. Actually, let's see. That one, maybe not. Let's see here. Yes, let me try one more. I won't spend too much time on this if I don't see it right away. One more. I'm looking for one that has a -B in the command line. Last try. But anyway, you see the command line differences. Okay, so just was going to call that out in case I could find it, the -B around BitLocker and so forth. But that's the detail of the update. And you can learn all sorts of information about the update just by clicking through and seeing what's there. Leverage this to be able to build your own updates and learn how to do that and so on. Now, there were some other options on the right-click menu, right? There's the ability to assign, right? Assign software, you see the pop-up there, assign selected software updates to a publication. So you see an option down here for publish. We'll get to that in a minute. You also see a publications workspace. So this assign will allow you to take an update and assign it to a group that you will create. We'll see that in a minute, where you can kind of group updates that you care about from a catalog together and publish them in bulk, or you can publish them individually. The way I think about it is in ConfigMgr by itself, we provide you all of the updates in the All Updates view, but you don't want to deploy all of those updates to your environment, right? Some of them may have no bearing on your environment at all. So typically in an enterprise, folks will assign a software update to a software update group and then manage the updates within the software update group collectively. That's downloading them from the internet, deploying them, etc. Same kind of deal. You can pick the updates that you want from the update catalog and put them in a generic container and publish them kind of all at once. Here's another thing, fast forwarding a little bit to third-party update integration. So I mentioned already that even with third-party update integration, there is an ongoing potential role for SCUP. If you're authoring your own custom updates, you need SCUP. Here's another difference. And I'll just say it here, and we'll see it more next time. If you have a third-party update catalog that you are obtaining and managing through third-party update integration in ConfigMgr, and that particular update catalog, we'll use HP for example, has greater than 4,000 updates, right? You have no ability to pick and choose which ones of those updates you want to publish to WSUS. You do have control over whether you publish metadata only or full content. Said another way, all of the updates in the catalog, when you obtain them through the third-party update integration, every single one of them, all 4,000, will be published to the WSUS catalog as metadata only. You can choose to download the content, right? And that's probably okay as long as you're keeping the WSUS catalog cleaned up and maintained, which you should. But that's a lot of updates, right? And so I kind of parallel it to whenever you select a particular product and classification for existing Microsoft updates, you're going to get every single update that applies to that mix of product and classification. You're not going to be able to pick and choose between them. You're going to get every one of them in that quote-unquote equivalent of a catalog. Right? So that's the same way it works here. If you don't want that, if you would rather be able to look at the HP catalog as an example and sift through all 4,000 plus of the updates that are there and decide, hey, out of these 4,000, I only want these 100 to be possibly actionable in my environment, then you can use SCUP to publish metadata only, full content, whichever you want, those updates to WSUS. And so instead of having your WSUS database contain 4,000 plus metadata representations of the update, you will just have the 100 updates that you chose out of that catalog published to your WSUS, right? Very distinct difference between using SCUP and using third-party update integration. Again, we'll talk about that more next time. But assign is how you choose to put an update in a publishing group, a group publication. If you want to take an existing update and mess with it a bit, strong cautions around doing that, then please always duplicate it, right? And then you can change it as you like, and it will be your own at that point, not something that's tied to the catalog and so on, right? But again, use that with significant caution. If you want to view the XML of the update and kind of see all the definition of how it's built and so on, you can do that. Here, there's also options to delete the update. Please don't do that, because if the update is published and you just go delete it without going through the life cycle, it can cause you problems. Export, publish the update, expire the update, and so on, right? So these are the various options that you have available to you. Now, while I'm here, let me just go through the publish option. So if I am wanting to publish individual updates, I can just click on publish. And we have three options. We have automatic. So remember at the beginning of this discussion, I was showing you the ConfigMgr tie-in. I'm not a huge probably fan of it, and maybe I just haven't seen scenarios where it communicates clearly the value. But in order for the audit, so what the automatic does is if during publication we look in the ConfigMgr environment because we have that integration and find out, hey, this update actually does have some systems that require it because we've actually already published it out there as metadata only, and let it go through some scanning, and now we've learned that there's systems that need the content. Then now, whenever we publish it again, we're going to publish with full content, right? Not metadata only, because there are some systems that indicate that the content's necessary, the deployment is needed. Here's the thing. In order to even learn that, you have to deploy metadata only to start with and let the scanning happen so that ConfigMgr reports back, hey, there's systems that need it, right? So either way you slice it, the first time you deploy the update, at the very minimum, it has to be metadata only, right? And only after we learn about it can automatic kick in and select over to publish full content. My strong preference is if I know what updates I need to manage, I want to be able to control full content or metadata only myself. Here's an option too. Sign all software updates with a new publishing certificate when published software updates have not changed, but the certificate has. Another way of saying this, like all certificates, the WSUS signing certificate will expire and need to be renewed. And so when that WSUS signing certificate is renewed, all of the content signed with the old version is now no longer valid, right? So we'll need to re-sign it. And so if you've just gone through renewing your WSUS signing cert, then having that option checked is a good idea to make sure that your content gets updated and signed appropriately, right? So these are your publication options. Let me go now to the publication workspace. So we'll talk about the workspaces. We'll come back to software updates for a minute. So the publication workspace allows me to create a new group. Now this doesn't call my eyes to the fact this is a group. Kind of like the equivalent is the software update group, right? This is a publication group. It doesn't tell me, oh, this is a group, right? But if I click on it, there are updates in the group. So if I go up here and say, okay, I want to assign this update to a publication group, I see there is one, or I can assign it to a new group, right? And then notice that the publication type for the group will be consistent for all updates in the group. You can't pick and choose among updates. It is all one way or all another, right? So I'll just call this HP group and add it. Right, now when I go back into the publications workspace, I have two groups, Adobe and HP. Now, these two groups just have one update each, but if I choose to publish either by clicking this or publish here, I get the same page, but all of the options are grayed out except sign, because again, the options for this group are created when the group is created. They're either going to all publish as full, all publish as metadata only, or all publish as automatic, right? So just understand. Now, this rules workspace, so I showed you in the updates themselves. Let me go back, edit. In the updates themselves, there's the applicability and installed rules, right? So those rules you can define in the update. You can also build the rules in the rules workspace. So I can go create a rule and call it test rule whatever. And then as I work through it, I can go create a brand new rule, whatever, tell it where I want to go get the detail for the rule, file system, registry, system, Windows installer, and then notice this one, saved rule. So if I've created rules already and I want to just reuse them, then I can do that. You know, we'll store the rules. You can then pick and choose between them and save some time rebuilding some things, right? So a pretty good ability to create and manage rules and so on. Then here's the catalogs workspace where you again see the catalogs that you've subscribed to and so on, right? Okay, so now back to the update workspace, because so far what we've talked about are vendor supplied updates. You can absolutely create your own updates. All you have to do for that is go to the All Software Updates node and create a vendor. So in my case, my lab environment is called Tailspin Toys. So maybe I have some applications in my environment that are custom to me. So I'll create a Tailspin Toys vendor, right? And underneath that vendor, I might have 4 or 5 line of business apps. I'm just going to go ahead and create a product. And this might be Tailspin. I'll have to click in it, don't I? Tailspin app 1, right? And good. So I can now start creating a new update, go into Tailspin app 1 and create an update, and then I have the same wizard I saw earlier. I just have to fill in the detail. Or I might have a third party that does not supply the software update catalog, but yet they supply the binaries and stuff to update. So I can go create a vendor, and maybe this is the commercially available widget vendor, right? And so this is the widget app 1, and create a product. Click over here, or whatever, and you start building with their binaries and so on. So you kind of use this to build your own catalog of this vendor's updates, right? So whatever works, and then you handle them all the same way. All right. So cool. That's kind of a walkthrough of the SCUP console itself. Now, before we start to get into how this all kind of is usable in ConfigMgr, there's some moving parts here. One of the things that I did to try to help illustrate, and part of it's what we just did, part of it's kind of forward-looking, is kind of build a flowchart. And so this is my attempt to visually walk you through exactly what's happening. So the first thing that needs to happen in the environment is the admin is going to enable SCUP publishing to an update server and choose whether or not to use self-signed or CA-generated options for the WSUS signing certificate. Step 2 is the WSUS signing certificate is either manually or automatically created and installed on the WSUS SUP server in the WSUS store, and then the certificate is either manually or, if you have third-party update integration, automatically moved to the Trusted Root Certificate Authority and Trusted Publisher stores, right? Then finally, 3, the administrator subscribes to desired vendor catalogs or builds custom updates, or maybe your line of business developers build the custom updates. If you do subscribe to third-party catalogs, then step 4 is those catalogs need to be downloaded along with any associated certificates. So I did that, and you saw me approve the certificates. That's step 4, where the SCUP application is going and downloading the content from the vendor. And then step 5, the administrator selects and publishes updates from the vendor or custom catalog. I keep saying administrator. It could be anyone who uses the SCUP console, even developers, whatever. Updates are published to the WSUS SUP as either full content or metadata only, right? So this is 5. So 5 here is publishing the update to WSUS SUP. So if it's just metadata only, it's just this direction. If it's metadata plus content, the metadata's copied over here, but we also download the content from the vendor and publish it over to WSUS. So to say a different way, any content related to the update is stored on the WSUS server and downloaded in advance, right? Then 6, the content files for any updates published, full content will be downloaded from the vendor during update publication, as I mentioned. Number 7, once all that's done, then in ConfigMgr, we need to initiate a traditional sync of ConfigMgr on the ConfigMgr server with WSUS. And what this is going to do is retrieve the new categories. I have categories here. It should say products. I thought I caught all of those and fixed them. But either way, it's here. And then once that's done, we have to wait for the sync to complete. And then looks like I caught this in the editing process. Either way. So I did fix number 8. I said products here instead of categories. But step 8, once we've synchronized, once we have the new products in, then select the newly available products for SCUP published updates. And then 9, initiate another traditional sync that's going to pull the updates over from WSUS to ConfigMgr, right? Step 9. And then finally 10, deploy the updates as normal. And whenever you're presented with the option of where to obtain the updates, just choose internet, because whenever we realize it's a third-party update, we know it's already on WSUS, and we'll try to pull it from there. Right? So that's kind of the flow. We've done part of it. Let's go continue and look at it on the ConfigMgr side. Okay, so let me pull back in the ConfigMgr server, and here we go. All right, so let me minimize SCUP and pull up the ConfigMgr console specifically. So actually, I'm going to let the ConfigMgr console pull up, and what we need to do is publish an update in SCUP. So I've got a number of them here. I'm just going to use Adobe again. So let me go to Reader, and I'll find one that I have not published. I've got a couple that are published. Let me grab, I don't know, let's see, this one as an example, and I'm going to publish it. Now I'm just going to do metadata only, right? Just to save time, and go ahead and publish that through. Now that's going to run through and connect to the update server, show you the update name, give you the update ID. After we check the cert, we're publishing now, and so do that now, we're done. Right? One updates were published, one updates was published metadata only. Now, what I can do, let me just go through this again. So maybe I want to publish this update, but this time I really want to publish it. Maybe I've let it scan in the environment, and I realize there are systems that need it. So instead of metadata only, I'm going to publish this as full content. So I go back to the same update. And by the way, before I do that, let me just show you. If I update this, then I should have a date published in the appropriate column at this stage, and I do. Right, so this one shows today as just published. So if I go and publish it again, I'll just choose full content, click next, and off we go. Right, fatal errors. That's what I was hoping for. View the log here. So this is the update publisher's log, and it's going to go through and tell you exactly what happened. And in this case, failed to connect to the update server. This couldn't get to the vendor for whatever reason, and that's fine. I don't care. That's what I was hoping, just to show you this log, but the different ways of doing it. So with the metadata, it's already stored in the catalog that I've synchronized from the vendor, so publishing is no big deal. If I'm going to get the content, I have to go back to the publisher's website and download that specifically and then try to publish it. So that's where the problem was, and we got the error. But either way, I've got some updates published, full content, out to ConfigMgr already. So let's minimize SCUP and pull open, hopefully, the ConfigMgr console. And so now, I've already gone through all of the synchronizations. If I had not, then the next thing I would need to do is trigger a synchronization. So here I would just go into Software Updates node, right-click on all software updates, and synchronize software updates. What that would do after an initial publication is, so assuming that I had never done that before and the Adobe HP products were not listed in my catalog, what that would do is cause those to, after the sync is complete, cause those to show up. So now I would go under Configure Site Components, Software Update Point, and my products, those would be added and listed. So I do have Adobe, right? And so that's good. So now that that's there, I can select the products and I go do another synchronization under Software Library. And this time, those updates that I have published in are available to me, right? So let's go look at that. So if I go to all software updates, right, now I can go to add criteria, and vendor will be important. So I'll choose vendor and click add, and Adobe shows up because it's alphabetically first. I'll just do another search, okay? And so I have a few updates here. Notice the color of the icon. Like with any software update, the color of the icon has meaning. Green means it's ready to go. This one is the one that I just published, and it's blue. It's blue because metadata only is set to yes. So this is the column that you would want to add in specifically for third-party updates. That one, and also vendor, probably would be of interest. But metadata only is indicated here, saying this one I cannot publish. I can't do anything with it. I can't deploy it, if you will. Right? If I click on the deploy wizard, it'll come up. I can supply some information here, right? Whatever, click next, and then I'm immediately blocked because it's metadata only, right? So I can't deploy it until I have full content there. Metadata only of no sounds like a negative situation, but in this case, it's what you want because these updates do have content and they can be published and they can be deployed. And this is the one that I have deployed and I have published. So at this stage, everything about this process is exactly normal, right? So if I go and I choose to deploy this one, and I've already got it deployed, but let me just pick a collection to go on through, right? Next, next, whatever, whatever. Now the download location will be, where is it? Well, I've already got it downloaded, that's the thing. As a part of this, if you don't have the update downloaded, you will need to grab it. Let me try this one. Yeah, download. So when I click on download, I can select my deployment package, right? And next, and then it tells me what download location, deploy from internet. When we hit this update, we know that the content's over in WSUS, and we'll just pull the content from there, right? But this is the update. I've got it deployed. Standard old deployment, no problem. And so at this stage, let me pull in my ConfigMgr client, right? So here's my client. And let me pull up Software Center. And I should have the update in a state ready to go, right? So at this stage, it should be in Software Center. It should be an available software update. No problem. It is. It's available. I can go click on it. I can start the install, and it proceeds exactly as normal. All of the normal logging on the client is the same. Well, in this case, it failed. I don't know why it did that. Let's try it again. All the normal logging on the client is the same, etc. Check into what caused that failure. Hang on. All right, let's try this again. Trying to do the install. So installing, and looks like it's off to the races at this point. So what had happened is that the system had lost its trust connection. This is my lab, so things kind of are in an odd place fairly routinely, but it lost its trust connection to the domain, and I think that's what was causing the error. So just waiting a minute here for it to move on and get to the stage where I know that download is working. So while it says preparing to download, let me just, I don't want to bog down the presentation here while it's doing it, but let me just make sure it's actually working on it, and I think it is. So CCM cache, yeah, we see this folder, we also see this in here, so it is working on it. Take a minute maybe, but I'll just let it perk along and pull this to the side, and we'll continue on and then see how it looks from there. But that's essentially it. Software updates, once you get them into ConfigMgr, it is fully the standard process to be able to deploy them, okay? All right. So in terms of this thing we keep referencing, third-party update integration, we'll talk about that focused in the next session, right? So what are the kind of two big buckets? First is the integrated bucket, right? The third-party update catalogs are obtainable, synchronizable, if that's a word, from Configuration Manager directly. Certificates and settings management are integrated with ConfigMgr, right? A little bit of an asterisk on the certificate stuff, depending on the versions of the catalog, but we'll talk about that in the next session. Settings management in terms of enabling certificate maintenance on WSUS, ConfigMgr to drive that, also enabling the client settings to be adjusted in through turning it on in client settings. Again, we'll see that in the third-party update management coming up. With third-party update management, there's absolutely still a role for SCUP. And we've already said it here, but just to call it out here, if you do need to author your own custom updates, then SCUP is the tool you're going to need to use, right? If you want to manage synchronizing individual updates from a catalog, versus every update in a catalog, then SCUP is the way to do that, right? Anyway, so you saw as part of what I was doing with synchronizing Adobe, let me just show this to you. I only have a few updates here that I've actually pulled in. But if I pull back in my technical preview site, where I'm doing third-party update management, go to software library and do the same thing. Well, console is seeming to not want to work for me right now. One moment, let me close it and reopen it. Here we go. Get rid of that too. All right. Okay, so go to software library and software updates and all software updates. And like before, let's focus on Adobe as the vendor. Add, search, right? So I have every Adobe update from the Adobe catalog in my technical preview site. Why? Because I cannot pick and choose which ones from the catalog to publish to WSUS unless I'm using SCUP, right? So just two big broad buckets of things that are important to understand between the two, and we'll dig into the third-party update management integration in our next session. Okay. Troubleshooting tips and tricks, right? So we've talked about a lot of this as we've already gone along. Logs. So I showed you the updates publisher log. It's under the user's profile, under app data local temp, and it's called update publisher log. We have the ConfigMgr log. So a lot of this works through the normal ConfigMgr processing. On the server side, we have WSUS where you can see the updates synchronizing the products that you're publishing from vendors, custom updates synchronizing, the WCM log, which will give you an initial indication that SSL is enabled for WSUS if you need to do that. When you're updating or installing installing updates on clients, then standard logging applies there. I showed you the certs and the stores you need to have them in for the server and also the client. Then I showed you on the server the registry key where you can validate that the WSUS server is using SSL if you have it configured to do that. I also showed you the GPO setting on the client that is required to enable deployment of third-party updates. So if you don't have those GPOs or certs in place in the appropriate cert stores on the client, then you'll get some cert chain errors, and once you decode the error code, it will talk about trusted root chain or things around that nature that will clue you in. Hey, check and make sure that the certs are there, and that if they are there, that they're not expired, etc. All right. So back to the catalog, and this is all I will mention about the catalog. I've mentioned several times now that there are a couple of different versions of the catalog. There's what I'm calling the legacy catalog, which is the catalog that came along with SCUP 4.5 and SCUP 2011, and there's the updated catalog, which is new in SCUP 2018. The main difference, and there's more to it than this, but I'll just suffice it to say here, if you have a legacy catalog, the catalog, as you download it, will be signed by a certificate from the vendor. And you will need to approve that certificate from the vendor, as you saw me do whenever I synchronize the updates, or the catalog, right? But this catalog will contain every single individual updates. There are certificates needed to sign these particular updates that are within the catalog. The certificates associated with the updates are not included in the catalog. So that's where you would, if you choose certain updates, be prompted again and again and again in SCUP to approve the new certificate, right? The updated catalog has a mechanism whereby the catalog is signed by a cert, and the updates plus any of the certs that are required by them are encapsulated in the catalog, right? That's all I'll say about it. When you're using SCUP, it largely is transparent to you. If you're using third-party update integration, it's a lot more visible to you, as you'll see when we go through that session. So all that said, that's SCUP, and that's our tour of SCUP, and definitely I think worth looking at for a whole bunch of reasons for ConfigMgr admins and businesses. So we'll wrap this session here, and we will see you next time to talk about third-party updates.